I wanted to mention that there's no Wednesday night Bible study this week, and Thursday after the Tenebrae service, those of you who would like to sing in church on Sunday would just meet with me just for a very short time, and we'll have something that you'll be able to take with you to prepare for singing on Easter morning. The gospel lesson for today is from Matthew's gospel, the 21st chapter, beginning at the first verse. When Jesus and the disciples had come near Jerusalem and had reached Bethphage, the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent 2 disciples, saying to them, "Go into the village ahead of you, and immediately you will find a donkey tied and a colt with her. Untie them and bring them to me. If anyone says anything to you, just say this, 'The Lord needs them,' and he will send them immediately." This took place to fulfill what had been spoken through the prophets, saying, "Tell the daughter of Zion, look, your king is coming to you, humble and mounted on a donkey, and on a colt, the foal of a donkey." The disciples did as Jesus said and had directed them, and they brought the donkey and the colt and put their cloaks on them, and he sat on them. A very large crowd spread their cloaks on the ground, and others cut branches from the trees and spread them on the road. And the crowds that went ahead of him and that followed him were shouting, "Hosanna to the Son of David! Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord! Hosanna in the highest heaven!" And when he entered Jerusalem, the whole city was in turmoil, asking, "Who is this?" The crowds were saying, "This is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth in Galilee." Here ends the gospel. In your life, there are times you may avoid them as much as possible. I know some people do, but there have been times when you've been part of a crowd, and sometimes you love a crowd. I know my children love to go to parades. Personally, I don't care much for parades, but that's only my opinion. But my kids loved parades, so every parade that ever came to any town we ever lived in, we had to go see the parade. I tried to keep that news away from my children, but somebody usually ratted me out and would come over and tell my kids, "Do you know there's a parade this weekend?" They did it to rile me up probably more than anything else. But so we went to all these parades and we went to these crowds. And of course, when you're a parent and you have kids in a crowd, it's a little nerve-wracking, isn't it? Because you're trying to keep track of these kids and they're caught up usually pretty much in the crowd thing. And the other thing is you have to keep yourself in shape, because when you have children in a crowd, you have to hold them up. And when you have 2 parents and 4 children, as we did, boy, it can be a little tough. Some crowds are wonderful. You love to go to the ball game, for instance, and be in the crowd. If you went to Fenway Park and there were 11 people there, you would say, "Hey, this isn't all that much fun." And you know that the political candidates usually try to pick a room smaller than they need, because it's more exciting if people are crowded together. You don't want to see a lot of empty space. And so I'm always grateful for this sanctuary, by the way, because I ministered in one sanctuary that had 35 to 40 people in attendance, and the sanctuary held 500. Looked a little thin, to say the least. And sometimes you look around a crowd and it's all the same kind of people. Everybody looks about the same. I think about that in the Holden Good Friday service when we get together on the Common. I mean, a lot of the people we even know, seen them many, many times. It's not a huge crowd, but it's a nice crowd, and they're all the same. And then sometimes you look at a crowd and it's very diverse. My daughter and her fiance had been in the crowd at the inauguration of President Obama, and of course that was an amazing sort of crowd, and Katie had a lot to report and a lot of pictures, and it was a very diverse, obviously, in the nation's capital, very diverse crowd. Now some crowds are on a mission. I'm thinking about the demonstrations with the case in Florida of the young man who was shot by the watch captain. And I know that those demonstrations are for a mission, a very distinct mission. The only crowds that I can remember participating in myself, anything like that, were the anti-war crowds during the Vietnam era. And I remember the criticism of those crowds. I was especially sensitive to it, of course, because I had just come out of the military. And a lot of people said, well, you know, those crowds are full of students and people on LSD and smoking pot and all those other kinds of things. I don't know. Those are people who supported the war, of course. And the fact of the matter was there were huge numbers, well-organized numbers of anti-war veterans. Men who had fought in Vietnam, as a matter of fact, were in those crowds. The Palm Sunday crowd must have been a conglomeration of all those things. Some people were on a mission. Some people were just curious and wanted to be part of this. And when a crowd gathered in those days, I think the town was drawn to it, to find out what was going on. Now, many in that crowd must have heard the stories of this person, Jesus. So they wanted to see him. They heard about who he was and what he was able to do, what he had done, the miracles and the healings. And just changing water into wine would have been enough to send a lot of people to see this guy. My sister, my late sister, and her husband lived in a town where they did a movie, and the movie Groundhog Day. And so they went to see Bill Murray and the other cast members, and they actually ended up having a pizza party with Bill Murray and a bunch of other people, because Bill Murray just loved to party. And so, and was a very open and wonderful guy. So their curiosity turned into a memorable, very memorable event. That's what people were hoping for with Jesus too. Now, he had also entered a call to the people for justice and peace and mercy and fair dealing and all the things that these people in Jerusalem were interested in, because they were living under the yoke of the Romans, and it was very oppressive. And so part of their hope was a political hope. Maybe this guy is going to make a huge change. And in Jewish thinking, the Jews believed that they should be in charge. And maybe this was the Messiah who was going to change all this. Here was Jesus in this great and holy and powerful city, God's chosen city, many of them believed. And the fact that that belief is still so strong is one of the reasons why the Middle East is in so much turmoil and so much pain, and why there's been so much violence in that area. The crowd must have been thinking, now something big is going to happen. You know? Now something really big is going to happen. Here comes God into our lives. We can feel it. We can see it. I also think about the effect all this had on the disciples. That was really more the important thing of this story. They were living with their own dream of the future, you know? We all have these ideas about what the future is going to be like. And so the disciples had this idea about what Jesus was going to do and how they were going to participate in it. They had very distinct ideas about what Jesus was going to do. Now, Jesus told them point blank that he was going to suffer, but the disciples couldn't take that in. The Son of God, how could the Son of God suffer? That's not possible. What's he talking about? And it certainly didn't fit in their dream. God would not allow such a thing, I believe, is what they were thinking. Jesus, caught in pain and tragedy, radical injustice, that's not possible. And the almost unspeakable sadness of this whole story, the disciples could not take in even the possibility. Certainly God would intervene. God would step in. But the disciples' dream about Jesus did not come true. Much like our experience, I think. We have very strong ideas about what God will and won't do in our lives. Some of the faith in this room is a rather mild faith. Some of the faith in this room is very strong and powerful faith. And if I was able to give you all the theological tests, a lot of you we would be very different people in our feelings about how God acts, what is available to us, what our prayers will and won't do. All of us sometimes, I think, know that some of our prayers have not been answered. The miracles haven't come at the time when we thought we needed them most. And not often at all, actually, miracles. And dreams of peace and justice die over and over again in our lives. So what is God doing? God is not acting as we think God should. You remember the first months of the war in Iraq? Some of us were against it, some of us were for it. And we were told that the crowds in Iraq were cheering our military when they came in. They were, I don't know if they were waving palm branches, but they were cheering. They were so happy that the Americans were there. Something happened because we went through so many years of tragedy in Iraq. And so the question becomes for you and for me, and it's a question that happens over and over again, why is it like this? Why do you suffer? Why do I suffer? And why doesn't God act? Why? Why do some people have so much misery and pain? And why do so many children die young? And why is the world so violent? Well, you have an answer for that? Please shout it out now because we'd all like to hear. God acts in ways beyond our understanding. Jesus acts in freedom and in love because this is what God gave him. Those are the tools that God gave to Jesus, freedom and love. And he depends upon God for everything else. But like the disciples, we live in another dream. We have another idea about what life should be. We are bound up and confined by our own thinking. And if we stop for a while and realize how our thinking holds us back sometimes, how our ideas that get locked in actually are holding us back, then we participate in the freedom and the love that Jesus lived. I'm reminded of the story that the Red Sox had a chance to sign Willie Mays. Y'all remember Willie Mays? Greatest center fielder that ever lived. But the Red Sox were racist. And they didn't want black Willie Mays on their team. They were locked in on their thinking. Can you imagine Willie Mays and Ted Williams in the same outfield? Man, there would have been some great years for the Red Sox. Which just goes to show you that this locked-in thinking by the management of the Red Sox was not only immoral, but it was damn dumb. But it was an example of this locked-in thinking. We can't even fully understand ourselves or those people we love the most. I had a counseling session not long ago, and the person said, "What am I doing? What am I doing with my life?" Didn't even understand what he was doing with his own life. And you can look back and see that often the people that you love the most are the ones you have harmed, you have hurt, you have betrayed, you have let down and disappointed, and you have not honored the love that they've given you because you had something else going on in your mind. The truth is, we maybe get a C+ at being human, but we can't even raise ourselves to an F at being God. If we try to be God, we fail. Try to understand everything that God gives to us, we fail. So given all that, what was Jesus doing? He was trying to give you and me a new vision, first of ourselves in the eyes of God. Who are you in the eyes of God? Jesus was teaching us that. And the world. What is this world in God's eyes? How should we be honoring this world from God's point of view? And the truth is, this vision is still unfolding from God's hand. Still unfolding. If you think you're a finished product, don't ever hold that up for a vote. Some folks would say, well, I hope you're not finished. I remember in a marriage counseling, a woman telling her husband this. This isn't the way you're going to be for the rest of the time, is it? He looked at her dumbfounded, absolutely surprised, like she expected some changes. He was still unfolding, not only in her world, but in God's world. Jesus was trying to give us a vision of ourselves as still in progress if we let God lead us. As far as I'm concerned, two of the greatest things Jesus ever said are these two statements. Be not afraid, and follow me.